In Creo Parametric, you can perform manual routing of cable harnesses. I created my original manual routing video back in Creo Parametric 6.0 in 2019. Here I am, it is 2023, and I am in Creo Parametric 10.0. I want to show you how to perform manual routing today with some of the enhancements to cabling in the past few years. Here I have my assembly open. In another video, I showed top-down design techniques for creating a harness subassembly and a skeleton model containing a couple of shrink wraps for the necessary geometry for routing my harnesses. Let's open up that harness in its own separate window so you can see my visual references. And at this point, I want to bring in the connectors for this particular harness. Before I assemble them though, let me open them up. I'll hit the open button and let me navigate to the folder that has them. I'm going to grab some D38999 connectors, and I know I want to grab an F-size connector. Let me show you this model. Now, first off, I'm going to admit, this model has way too much geometry than you would normally want to use. You can see from the stamping that this is a connector from Amphenol. If you go to Amphenol's website, you can find some highly detailed models available to you. But the important thing about these models is that I've added a coordinate system called entry, and that's going to be used as the start and end of the wire harnesses that I am going to route. So there you can see it in the middle. And the important thing about the coordinate systems that you set up is that the z-axis wants to point in the direction of the routing of the wire. In addition to that, I have added an axis. Oops, I accidentally hit the wrong button. Let me delete that new axis that I created. I meant to show this particular axis. I also have an axis that can facilitate in routing of the wires. And also I've added a component interface that will help place this component in the assembly. So that's good. Let's hit the X in order to close out. And I'm going to zoom in where I'm going to bring in that connector. Let's go to the assemble button, and I will grab the F-size connector, which would go in here. Because of the component interface, it wants me to select the cylindrical reference for placing it, and then a flat reference, and I think I want this little flat surface there. And then for the angle orientation, sorry for the flashing on the screen, I will select that surface, and that looks good for placing it. Let me hit the check mark in order to locate that one in the model. And let me throw in a couple of E-shell connectors over on the other side. I'm not going to put in all 12 of them. And I'm going to turn off my coordinate system visibility to unclutter the screen. Let me hit the assemble button, and I will choose the E-shell connector for going over here. And once again, I am selecting a cylindrical surface and then a flat planar surface, and then for the other one, a vertical surface. Now let me hit the flip button. I don't really need to flip it, but I sort of like having it exactly the way that I want. So that's good for the first one. I'm going to throw in 3 more. Since I have a component interface, I just need to hold down the right mouse button and choose new location. And then let's choose this, and then zoom in and choose this surface, and then this one for orientation. And that's good for the second one. Let's throw in a couple more. I will go to new location and throw in one here, and then pick there. And for the last one, right mouse click, new location. Pick my necessary references. And now I've got all of the connectors that I need for routing. And for a moment, I'm just going to hide the skeleton model just so that you see that all that I have in here are the connectors, and then I'm going to route my wires and cables between them. The reason that I am using a separate subassembly for this is so that I can manage this as one self-contained unit in my product lifecycle management system. Speaking of PLM, let's take a moment to thank today's sponsor. This video is brought to you by Arena, a PTC business. Arena is the proven market leader in cloud product lifecycle management with over 1,300 customers worldwide. They're focused on helping manufacturers move away from spreadsheets and other manual, disconnected systems to accelerate innovation. Keeping your internal teams and external partners aligned throughout new product development is essential to avoiding costly design errors and product delays. By bringing together bills of material and the entire product record in a single system, Arena PLM enables everyone to collaborate in real time on the latest designs and reduce engineering change order cycle times. Your mechanical, electrical, and software engineers can address design for manufacturability and interoperability with downstream stakeholders and supply chain partners early in the development process. This minimizes BOM risks and helps release products faster. Visit the link here to learn more about how Arena can help speed engineering design efficiency with one connected system. Now back to our video. For routing our wires and cables, there are some other components that I can add to my harness assembly, and those are my backshells for strain relief. And as I'm adding them, I want to reduce some screen clutter on my computer, so I'm going to hide my skeleton. And let's go to our layers. I know that I'm going to need to see some of my default datum planes for my connectors. Let me hide the default datum planes of my harness assembly and of my skeleton model. And I will make the default datums of my two different connectors visible. That's good. Let me close my layers, and I will make sure that my plane display is turned on. So now let's zoom in over here. Let's add in our first back shell. I will click on the Assemble button. Then I'm going to navigate to a folder on my computer where I have some standard M85049 backshells. And these are from some Amphenol files that I downloaded online. So there's a little bit of detail, but that's okay. And for the M85049s, if they have a 38 number, that is a straight back shell. If they have a 39 number, that is a right angle back shell. I'm going to grab the -19, that corresponds to the F size. And because I have a component interface, it wants to know what cylindrical surface I want to use, and then what flat planar surface that I want to use. And then for making it parallel, I will select this plane in the model. Let's change it from 90-degree angle to 0. It's upside down from the way I want it. Let's hit the flip button. So that's good for my first back shell. I will hit the check mark, and there we see it added to the model. If I turn on my axis display, there is an additional axis in the back shell that will help me route my wires and cables. Okay, let's repeat the process over on the side for my different E shell D38999 connectors. Let's hit the Assemble button, and this time I will grab the straight ones with the -17 because that corresponds to the E shell. I'll click the Open button, and once again, because I have a component interface, I will select my cylindrical surface and then flat surface, and then the plane that I want to use to align it. Let's change this. Let's try 0 degrees. That looks great. Now let's go to add a couple more. Like before, I can right mouse click and hold and choose new location, and then pick the cylindrical surface and the flat surface and the plane to be parallel to. And for some reason, it changed it to an angle offset. Let's go right to parallel. All right, let's do another location. And let's go to the third connector, cylindrical surface, flat surface, plane. Make sure it changes to parallel. And for the last location, right mouse click and hold, new location, cylindrical surface, flat surface, and then the datum plane. And let's go back to parallel. All right, so that's good. I will hit the check mark. So in that way, I've added in my 4 backshells for the E-size connectors, and over on the side there is the other one. Let's bring back the visibility of the skeleton model and turn off our datum plane display. So now I've got all my different connectors in here. Let's go to cabling mode. I'll go to the applications command and then cabling. Now I am in cabling, and there is one really big change in cabling in Creo Parametric 10.0. Take a look at my model tree. We now have a split in here because there is a dedicated cabling tree. And there are 3 different choices that you have in here. The first one is the cable view, then you have the bundle view and the connectivity view. We're not really seeing anything in here because I haven't done anything in cabling yet. So let's start off. The very first step that we're going to do is create our harness part. So I'll choose that. We get the new dialog box and part is selected with the subtype harness. Let me call it my 1970 cable harness. And I will use my default template. Let's click the OK button. And for that reason, it didn't like the one that I had selected. I probably didn't set the config.pro option for using the correct set of units. Let me make sure that I am using one of my metric templates and then click the OK button. So that's one thing to be aware of. Your harness part has to have the same set of units as your cabling assembly. All right, so now that we have started our cabling assembly, there you can see it down at the bottom of the tree. I will go about designating my different connectors. So let's go to the Auto Designate dropdown and choose Designate. Auto Designate is used when you have an XML file or some other kind of neutral file that is brought in from a 2D schematics package. But let's choose Designate. And for the first component to designate, I'm going to select my, right now it's giving the harness part. There we go. There is the connector that I want to use. Then it prompts us to enter a file name to read connector parameters from. I'm just going to hit the check mark. You can usually use your default parameters. And then we need to specify what entry ports we want to route from. So I will choose entry ports, and you can make your coordinate systems visible on the computer screen. Right now, though, it's showing me my part default coordinate system, and I can see if I really don't see the entry coordinate system in there. It might be on a layer that's hidden. In that case, you can just navigate to the component in the model tree, and there indeed is the entry coordinate system hidden. So I will select it from there and then click the OK button. Then it asks me for the internal length of cable inside the connector. And that way you can make sure that your cables are the right length. I'm just going to assume that 0 is correct for this one. So let me hit the check mark for that. And then it wants to know how multiple wires are going to go in there. If you just choose the wire option, it will just accept a single conductor, but you can either have a flat grouping or a round grouping. Well, for a D38999, this should be a round grouping. And then I can click done because I'm not going to add any other entry ports in there, and then done once more. And so for the next ones I'm going to do, once again, I think it's going to be convenient if I then hide my skeleton for a moment, just so that I don't get a whole lot of flashing when I am working in here. So now let's designate the other ones. I will go to the designate command, and then it asks me to select a component. So I will select my circular connector. Once again, I'll just hit the check mark and then entry ports, and let's select the one called entry and then click OK. I'll use 0 again for the internal length and a round grouping, and then done and done. And I'm going to do it one more time for you, and then I'll speed through it, just because I want to show you something that's going to happen once I try to designate the second connector that has the same model as one of the other connectors. So let me grab the same D38999, and I'll hit the check mark. And now we get this message that the reference designator already exists. What happens is when you designate a component of a certain model name the first time, it's going to use the model name as the reference designator. So it's asking us to give a different reference designator. I'm going to change my reference designators in a moment for all my different components. So I'm just going to accept the values for now and then go to entry ports and then add modify. Let me grab the coordinate system called entry and then click OK, 0 for the internal length and a round grouping. Okay, and so I'm just going to speed through the other two really quickly. Let me designate those. Okay, so now I want to change the names of the reference designators for my different components. To do that, I can go to the cabling parameters command. Now it prompts me to select an assembly member representing a connector. And I'm going to try using the control key to select all of them at the same time, then click the OK button. So here I have my different reference designators. And again, it's using the names of the components and then adding those underscores in a number for the multiple instances of them. I'm going to change them. I want this one to be my P1 reference designator. I like to give the name of the harness underscore and then P1 and hit the enter key. So that is good for that one. Now let me go to the first of the smaller shell size, and I will call this one my 1970 P2. Then let's go to the next one, and I'm going to call this one 1970 underscore P3 and 1970 underscore P4 and 1970 underscore P5. All right, let's click the OK button out of there. Okay, one thing I like to do is make sure that my reference designator column is visible. Let's go to the columns icon. Oh, I see that designation is already in there. Let's click OK and make sure that we have the display of columns visible. And there we see our reference designators. Okay, now that we have designated our different connectors, I am going to create my spools. But before I create my spools, I want to make sure that I have colors corresponding to the colors that I want the different wires to be. So let me go to my View tab, and I'm going to go to my Appearances, and then Appearances Manager. And I'm going to open up another Appearances file, and that's one, make sure that I just have the additional colors that I want to use. And so, for example, in here, I can see that we have a color black with letters BLK, and then I have blue, BLU, and green, GRN. I think I've got another one in here down at the bottom for red. So I can use those for my different spools. Let's choose close out of there and go back to the cabling tab. To create my spools, I will go to the spools command. This opens up the menu manager. I will click the create button, and I'm going to create some wire spools. And for the name of the spool, let's call this, I'm going to use some 16 AWG1, so I'll call this one 16 AWG underscore red and hit the enter key. And then let's make the electrical parameters dialog box wider. And so we've got the name and the type, and we have the thickness and the minimum bend radius, and they're going to be in units of millimeters. And for a 16 AWG wire with insulation, that's actually going to be 3.1 millimeters. So I'll enter in that value there. And for the minimum bend radius, usually you use a multiplier times the thickness, usually between 2x and 8x. And so I'm just going to use 2x. Let's use a value of 6.2 for that value. And then for the color, I'm going to enter in the name of the color that I have in my appearances file. So let's use red for that. and I will click on the OK button. Let's create another spool. This will be a wire spool, and this one will be 16 AWG, and this will be green. And let's choose the same values as before, 6.2 for the minimum bend radius and 3.1 for the thickness. And for the color, I will type in GRN and hit the Enter key. And let's create one last wire spool. I'll hit the Create button and then Wire. And this one will be 16 AWG blue, and enter in the value 3.1. Oops, actually use 6.2 for that one. Thickness is going to be 3.1. And for the color, well, that's just going to be BLU. And again, I'm making sure that it corresponds to the name of the color that I have in my appearances file. And then click the OK button. I had that additional black color, but I'm going to use that for a bundle later on. So let's hit the Done Return button. Actually, I just want to point out that save yourself time and effort. You can write your different spools out to a file to save yourself time and effort. So that's good. Let's click on the Done button. And let's grab our skeleton model and make it visible again. So for routing, I also need to have my coordinate systems displayed. That often helps. Let me go to my F connector, and I noticed that earlier before the entry port was hidden. Let's make that visible, and let's hide the default coordinate system. And for my E-size connectors, I notice that the default coordinate systems are visible for those. Let's hide them. And looks like I also have, is that my harness? Oh no, there's some default coordinate system there that's visible. Let me hide that one. All right, that was for my actual harness part itself. So now I've got the wires that I want to use. Let me turn on my axis display for my routing. Let's create our different wires. So to do that, I will go to the Route Cables button. And for this one, then let's go to this button here for creating a new wire feature. You also have the ability to create a new cable feature or a ribbon cable, or you could search for cables if you brought them in from, say, Creo schematics. But anyhow, I will create a brand new wire, gives it the name W1, and then you're going to select where you're going to start from and where you're going to go to. If you go to the options drop-down list, you do have the option to specify that you're going to use undesignated coordinate systems. You don't actually have to designate your coordinate systems first, but I did, so that saves me time and effort. So I'll choose the entry coordinate system from over here, and then let me choose the to location as being this particular entry coordinate system. And it just gives it a simple route, just gives a little preview of it going from the first location to the other location, obeying the minimum bend radius. From the drop-down list, you do have the ability to follow an existing cable or an existing pipeline. If I had something called a network that exists, I could use that as well, but I don't. So let's choose the OK button out of here. And now we've got our first wire routed. And by the way, I didn't notice what spool that I chose for that one. So if we select that wire, let me just grab it out of the tree here. I can choose the route button. And in this particular situation, I see that I used the 16 AWG red spool. If you wanted to change the spool that was used, well, you could go to your cable parameters, select the particular cable, and then hit the OK button. And from here, I could say, hey, maybe for that one, I didn't want to use the red spool. I can go to my drop-down list and say that my first one, I wanted to use the blue spool. And I'll click the OK button. And let's repaint the screen and regenerate. Now it is blue in color because I have that color in my file. But this isn't the routing that I want to have. So I need to insert some other additional locations. So I will select the wire, right mouse click and hold and choose Insert Locations. Let me start out by zooming in over here, and I'm going to change from the thick cable display to a centerline display. That'll make it a lot easier. And for the first location that I'm going to choose, I want the next location to be on the entity, just making sure that that is selected. I'm going to highlight the routing axis, that datum axis from my back shell. Now I can make sure that comes off nice and straight off of the back shell. And then for the next location, I'm also just going to drop it right onto the surface of my skeleton, and you can see how the preview updates. Maybe I'll just update it and just move it around, and you can see how the preview goes, and that's fine. For the next location, I like to use the use direction option, and then I can pick, say, this edge over here, and I can have it going nice and straight about over to here. Ends up being pretty close in line with that channel that I have in my skeleton. For the next location, I'm going to change to on, but I also have the option for doing a long axis. I'll pick this axis, and now it's going right on there. Let me make sure that I still have a long axis selected, so I can pick this axis over here. So it gives me a nice straight portion. For the next one, let me deselect a long axis, and the option is still using on for that one. I'm just going to drop it right about on the surface here. And again, I can take a look to see if it's exactly where I want, maybe change it a little bit. And then for the next one, I want it going sort of like along this wall here and around here, and then back in front of my LRUs. So let's change next location to use direction. I'll choose this and go along straight a distance. And then let's do next location to on and pick over here. That's good. And I use a lot of use direction. Pick an edge in the model for that one. And now I'm going to put in a few more locations. And since I'm going to route other wires and cables, I'm going to select some points right by these other different connectors, which will be a nice entry port or entry or exit location for my routing. So let's go to next location on, and I'll use right about over here. And then for next location, let's use direction. I'll use this direction here. That's a little too much. Again, I want it to be able to come right off of my routing and go into this entry port. So that's good. Let's go to next location, use direction, and about this far. Yeah, that's good. By the way, you do have a dimensional value that you can change in here. Sometimes I do change the directional values, but I also find that that can be a little bit of overkill. And for the last location for this one, I want to make sure that's going along my axis that is coming out of the back shell. So let's choose on and get the axis to highlight. So it's coming nice and straight out of there. So that is good for all those additional locations. I will hit the check mark, and I like that. That's some nice routing in there. Let me change to a thick cable display for a moment. You can see how it is proceeding through there. So that's good. Let's create a few other different wires. Let's create, I guess, 3 different wires. All right, so let's go to the route cables command. And I will choose create a new wire feature. And this is going to be wire 2. For this one, let's make it green. And let's see, for my starting location, I'll choose this entry port. And then for the ending location, I'll choose the entry port on one of my other different connectors. Again, we have the preview of where it's going to go. And for simple route, I can change to follow cable. And so for the cable to follow, let me select this cable over here. And this just makes it nice and easy. I can choose for the from location to follow. Let me choose the same location that I have for the first cable. I'm going to follow all the way along to this particular point. And so there you can see that it is going along the same path. Let's hit the apply button so it will make that wire in the model. Let's create another wire. And for this one, this time I will use the red wire. And it is following the same cable harness by default. Let's choose from going to here. And then the to location will be this entry port. But I don't want it following all the way to that location. So let me click in this collector and change it to this location. There it is. Just some really beautiful stuff there. Let's hit the apply button. And I'll create one last wire going to my other connector. Let's go back to the blue wire, and we're going to go from this entry port over to this entry port. And for the to location, let's have it come off of this location point. Oh yeah, and click the OK button. I do want to add some other additional location points so that they come straight out of the back shell. So let me select the wire, insert location, and select the axis. I like it coming off a little bit straight on the end there. Okay, so that's good for that one. Let's go to this wire, right mouse click, insert location, and select the axis, coming nice and straight out of the back shell. And then one last one that we're going to do over here. Select it, right mouse click and hold, and choose insert locations, and grab that axis there. Drag it out a little bit. And hit the check mark to complete that. Let's turn off our axis and coordinate system display and go to the thick cables. And so that way I have routed them. Let's take a look at some of the other different options that we can do inside of here. We can also add bundles around the different wires. So let me go to my spools command, and I'm going to create a brand new spool. But instead of being a wire or a cable or ribbon, this is going to be of the type sheath. And for the spool name, I'm just going to call this my bundle spool and hit the enter key. And there it's got the name, it's got the type shrink. For the wall thickness, let's use a bigger value that you can see. A little bit too big, but again, I just want you to be able to see it. Let's use a wall thickness of 2. For the minimum bend radius, let me try a value of 8. And we have units millimeter, pre-shrink inner diameter. I'm going to leave that as a value of 0. Let me make this even wider just so I can get to that last column for the color. And in this particular case, I'm going to use BLK for my black, because that is the name of the color I have in my appearances file. I'll click OK and done. And let me change over to a center line display. I'm doing that so I can select the location points for when I make my bundle. I'll go to the bundle command, and this is another change in Creo Parametric 10.0. It's automatically going to suggest a bundle name for you. In this case, it's going to be bundle underscore the next available number, which is a 1. I will hit the check mark for that. For the grouping, I will choose round. Then you can either create your spool here or choose your pre-existing spool. And you can either create the spool unrouted so it doesn't have any wires and you can put them in later, but already have the wires. So I'm going to choose a long path. The third option is a branch if you have your different bundles coming together at a T. So I'll choose a long path. And then the message area is prompting me to pick a location to define one end of the path. And I'll select this particular location over here. And then for the one on the other end, let me choose this location. And then it prompts me to choose which wires I want to include in the bundle. I'm going to select all and then choose Done Select. You can read in a file for some bundle parameters, but that's generally not necessary. And it's then putting everything together in the bundle. I don't need to flip it. Let's go back to our thick cable display, and now we can see how everything is bundled together. Okay, let's talk about a few other different things that have been added since I made that Creo Parametric 6.0 video. If you take a look in your cosmetics section, there are a couple other different options in here. You can now create branch tape at your different branches, and also you can create stiff shrink features. And the big one I mentioned earlier is the addition of your cable tree. And so right now we are in our cable view, so we can see our different wires. There is an expand all button that you have, so you can see everything within the wires. It's got the spool listed. You've also got your different segments and all the locations that are involved in those different segments. And so this gives you a pretty good idea of the sense of the routing in your model. The other option that we have here is the bundle view, and I'll take my bundle and expand it. And so we can see the bundle and the different wires that belong to it. And you can expand that to see their individual bundle segments. And then we have our connectivity view. So we've got all our different cabling connectors. Once again, we can expand all. And so inside of here, we can see the wires that are in there and the entry ports that they route to and from, as well as the reference designator notes that are associated with them. And so that's how you can use the cable tree. Some other different things to mention: there have been some enhancements that have been made to your commands for splitting and merging harnesses. I'll show that in another video. Also, there were some enhancements made to refitting and reordering your reference designators. And another one is that you can actually add cables to your model right when you are in the cabling application. It used to be that you would have to exit out of cabling, but now you can go to the model tab. If I wanted to add another different component in here, you can either use the assemble button. Now you get this dialog box that's going to ask you what assembly should get the new component. The reason that you could not assemble components in Creo 9 and earlier when you were in the cabling application is because the harness was the active component, but this dialog box allows you to select which component is actually going to get the component that you're adding, and then you could pick whatever connector that you wanted to use. But I'm not actually going to add one. Let's cancel out of here. So now that I am done with cabling, well, I can go back to my skeleton and I can hide it. And that way we can see the cable that we have routed. Let me go back to my cabling assembly itself, and you can see how the wires are routed between my different line replaceable units. So there you have it. That is how cabling is updated for 2023 with Creo Parametric 10.0.